probably haven't, at least not as Ezekiel did, as we heard in the Old Testament reading for today. Ezekiel was a prophet who lived in ancient Babylon, where his people, the Israelites, had been exiled. Now, Ezekiel was a prophet, and prophet means someone who speaks forth, someone who speaks out. And Ezekiel was led by the hand of God to this valley of dry bones, where God told him to speak to the dry bones, to prophesy to them. Ezekiel speaks, and then he hears a rattling, and he watches as bone is knit to bone, and sinews, flesh, blood, and living breath follow. Ezekiel is told by God that these bones represent the house of Israel that is in exile, this house of Israel that has suffered so much at the hands of the Babylonians and has utter hopelessness facing them. And so the question is this vision that Ezekiel tells us, is this merely a fanciful vision, or is it an actual prophecy? Did the bones actually receive flesh, blood, and breath? And the answer is that they did, in fact, because the Israelites returned to Israel from their prophecy, returned to Israel from their exile a generation after Ezekiel had this prophecy. And so again, if I ask, have you surveyed the valley of the dry bones? You probably haven't, as Ezekiel did. But more likely, you have faced a situation in your life that is a situation of utter hopelessness. A situation in your life, in your family's life, in the life of our culture. A situation that appears to you as bleak and as lifeless as the valley of dry bones that was spread out before Ezekiel. I've certainly faced such a situation, and perhaps we all face such a situation today. Now, Jesus, he certainly faced his situation of despair. We know that because we heard this in today's gospel. Jesus learned of the death of his friend Lazarus, and Jesus wept tears of sadness. After a time of mourning, Jesus goes and raises Lazarus from the dead. Now, I was discussing prophecy in the context of Ezekiel, who spoke of things to come. And Jesus raising Lazarus, this is something of a prophecy as well, because it foreshadows Jesus' own triumph over death and the grave, and in turn our own. Now, I think there's an instructive parallel between the experience of Ezekiel standing with God and calling the dry bones spread out before him to have flesh and breath, and the experience of Jesus standing at the tomb of Lazarus and calling his friend back to life. Because both these situations involve the action of God bringing new life to a situation of apparent death and hopelessness. And in both cases, life from death does not appear from nowhere. Because in both stories, new life is carried by human words and human action. The choice to see and to act, and the choice to speak words of God. But if these stories have a certain parallel, the difference between the two is even more significant. And this is the point I really want to make. In the valley of the dry bones, we see the central character of God. God brings life out of death. He brings hope out of the situation of despair. In the raising of Lazarus, we see that same character of God. But in the raising of Lazarus, God does not stand beside Ezekiel as God stood beside Ezekiel when Ezekiel prophesied. Rather, God stands as Jesus Christ. God stands as the one who took on our humanity. and then Jesus in their presence. Jesus wept as well, as Jesus surveyed his own valley of dry bones, the death of his dear friend. Jesus wept